Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. It was supposed to be just another quiet night at home. I had just moved into this house on the outskirts of Fresno, California, seeking a fresh start. The house was old, built in the 70s, but it had a charm to it. Nothing too fancy, but big enough for me to feel like I had space, and the privacy was a welcome change after years of living in cramped apartments. The place was filled with potential, or so I told myself. It had that cozy, secluded feel, the kind of place that makes you feel safe. Or so I thought. The night was creeping in, the sky turning a deep shade of purple, the kind that only happens when the stars start to flicker faintly through the fading light. It was late, maybe around 11:30 p.m. The neighborhood outside was quiet, eerily still. Not even the distant hum of cars could be heard. The kind of silence that stretches for miles and fills every corner of your mind, making you feel as though you're the only one left on Earth. The only sound in the house was the gentle hum of the refrigerator, a constant reminder that life was still happening somewhere, and the occasional rustling of my dog, Max, as he shifted on his bed by the couch. Max is a German Shepherd mix, big, strong, and loyal. He's the kind of dog that will sit by your side when you're sad and protect you when you're in danger. He's a gentle giant, usually calm, but fiercely protective when he feels something is wrong. He had been with me through thick and thin, so I trusted him more than anyone. But tonight, something felt off. I had just finished eating dinner and was settling into the couch with my phone, trying to unwind after a long day of work. Everything was perfectly normal, or so it seemed. Then, out of nowhere, Max stood up from his spot and walked toward the hallway, his paws tapping against the hardwood floors. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just getting comfortable. But then I heard it. Low, guttural growls. It was a sound I'd never heard come from him before. Max had always been a laid-back dog, playful and affectionate, but this was different. It wasn't playful or happy. This growl was deep, threatening. It rumbled from his chest, full of tension, like a warning. My heart rate quickened as I looked up from my phone. Max was standing in front of the basement door, his body stiff, his hackles raised, eyes fixed on the door as though it were the source of some unspeakable danger. His tail was low, not wagging, just rigid and tense. I frowned, confused. The basement door had always been locked. I hadn't been down there in days, maybe even weeks. The only time I'd gone down was to check the furnace, and even then it didn't leave much of an impression. The basement was nothing special, just a concrete floor, a few old shelves, and an air of mustiness that clung to the place, but nothing unusual. Yet the way Max was staring at it now made my blood run cold. "Max, what's wrong, buddy?" I called out, trying to snap him out of his trance. But he didn't respond. He just kept growling, louder now, his eyes fixed on the door like it was the very thing that had caused the darkness in the room. His growl wasn't a simple warning anymore. It was primal. It was the growl of an animal sensing something dangerous, something wrong. I stood up slowly, my feet cold against the hardwood floor, and walked over to him. "Hey, Max, stop it. There's nothing there." I reached down to pet him, hoping to calm him, but the moment my hand made contact with his fur, he jerked away violently, baring his teeth. His growl shifted into a snarl, the kind that sends a chill down your spine. This wasn't normal. My stomach sank. Max had never acted like this before. He was usually calm, protective, but never aggressive without cause. Now I was starting to feel the unease creeping up my spine. Something was wrong. Something was off about that basement. I forced myself to shake it off. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Just the wind, maybe. The house was old and it settled a lot. Perhaps there was a draft or something that was causing the odd noises. I had read online that old houses could do strange things. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my gut telling me that this wasn't just a simple creak in the floorboards. "All right, Max, I'll go check it out," I muttered, trying to sound braver than I felt. But inside, I was already regretting the decision. My stomach was in knots, my palms were sweaty, but I couldn't back down now. Max was acting out of character, and I needed to understand why. I walked over to the basement door. Max stayed behind me, growling low, his eyes never leaving the door. The old oak door, solid and worn with time, stood before me like an ominous threshold, its rusty doorknob beckoning me closer. The faint smell of mildew, damp earth, and aged wood hit me as I reached for the knob. The house had been empty for a while before I moved in, and the smells of neglect still lingered in the air. I turned the knob slowly, the hinges creaking as the door opened. A wave of cold air rushed up the stairs, sending a shiver through me. I could barely see into the basement. Only a dim light from the hallway above illuminated a small portion of the concrete steps leading down into darkness. I stepped cautiously down the stairs, every sound amplified in the silence. Max's growls had faded slightly, but they were still there, faint but constant. His warning like an echo. Halfway down the stairs, I froze. It wasn't the darkness that stopped me. It was something else, an overwhelming sense of pressure, as if the air around me had thickened. My breath caught in my throat. The hairs on my arms stood up and my heart began to pound in my chest. I felt it, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I wasn't alone. I didn't know how I knew, but I could feel eyes on me, even if the room was empty. Max's growls had become frantic, desperate. The deeper I went, the louder and more frantic they became, like he was warning me, no, begging me to stop, but I couldn't turn back now. I took another step, my foot landing on the next stair with a soft thud, and then I heard it. A sound. It was faint at first, like something dragging across the floor, slow, deliberate, and just out of reach. My heart skipped a beat, my body tensed. The sound stopped as quickly as it had started, and I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. Nothing. I swallowed hard, shaking my head. It was probably a rat, I told myself. Maybe something had scurried across the floor. I wasn't sure, but whatever it was, I wasn't about to find out. I turned to head back up the stairs, eager to leave the basement behind, but just as I reached the landing, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. A scrape. Something or someone was moving around down there. My blood cold. I didn't hesitate. I bolted back up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me and locking it with a hurried motion. My hands were shaking, my breath ragged, and I could hear Max's growls now, louder, more aggressive, as if he were warning me about something even worse than I had realized. I didn't know what was down there, but I wasn't going back to find out. I tried to calm myself. I sat back down on the couch, heart pounding in my chest, and tried to distract myself. But nothing could distract me from the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the door. My phone buzzed with a message from a friend, but I didn't even bother to look at it. I couldn't focus. Without thinking further, I immediately dialed 911, my hands trembling as I punched the numbers into my phone. The urgency of the situation took over. My voice was unsteady when the dispatcher answered, and I could barely make sense of my own words. "There's someone in my basement." The dispatcher's voice was calm, steady, a sharp contrast to the panic in my own. "Stay calm, sir. We are sending someone to check. Please stay on the line with me." Then suddenly everything changed. The basement door exploded open. The sound of the door slamming against the wall echoed through the house, loud and sudden. My body jerked, heart skipping a beat. My breath caught in my throat as I whipped around to face the door. My eyes were wide, my pulse pounding in my ears. Max's growl had shifted into a deep, ferocious snarl, his teeth bared, body rigid with tension. I froze, unable to move, as a figure stepped out from the basement. A man. But not just any man. He wore a mask, featureless, white, and smooth, like something out of a nightmare. The kind of mask that strips away humanity and leaves only the unknown. The man didn't say a word. He moved with speed, grabbing me by the shoulders and throwing me to the ground. My breath left me in a rush, and before I could even react, his hands were around my throat, squeezing. The world began to darken at the edges. I struggled, gasping for air, but I was too weak to break free. His grip was tight, unyielding. But then, just as I thought I was done for, Max lunged. The sound of his teeth sinking into the man's arm was sickening, sharp like a crack of thunder. The man let out a strangled yelp of pain, loosening his grip just enough for me to gasp for air. That was all I needed. I scrambled away, my vision swimming, and managed to make it to the kitchen. My hands shook as I grabbed the first thing I could find, a knife, cold and reassuring in my grip. Max was still barking, still fighting the man, who was now stumbling backward, cursing under his breath. Blood dripped from his arm, but he wasn't backing down. I knew I wasn't strong enough to take him on in a fight, but I had no choice. I had to do something. I had to protect myself. Then, as if answering my desperate thoughts, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a police siren, getting louder and louder, growing closer. It was like a lifeline thrown into the chaos. I hadn't realized how much I had been hoping for that sound until it pierced through the tension in the room like a burst of light through a dark cloud. The man, realizing that his window of opportunity was closing, made a quick turn, bolting for the door. His footfalls were heavy and panicked as he rushed toward the exit, his blood-streaked arm dangling at his side. I stood there, still gripping the knife, my chest heaving with every breath. Max was by my side, his fur bristling with anger and adrenaline, but also, it seemed, with a need to comfort me. The man didn't get far. As soon as the front door slammed behind him, I heard the screeching of tires, the flashing red lights, dancing through the windows. The police were here. They shouted for the attacker to, "Hands up! Get on the ground!" I stepped outside, my legs shaky, still gripping the knife that now felt like a distant memory of the chaos. One of the officers approached me, his eyes scanning the scene quickly. "We've got him. He's not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. I let out a shaky breath, but the officer wasn't done. "You're safe now," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "This wasn't a random attack. We've been tracking him for weeks. He's been targeting people living alone, off in secluded homes like yours. He'd break in, but always in the dead of night, and he'd use fear, intimidating his victims without ever actually doing the job himself. Until tonight." A chill ran down my spine as the officer spoke. "We think he was waiting for you to go down to the basement. When you did, he would have had you cornered. Lucky for you, your dog reacted. That's what set him off. He wasn't expecting a fight." I could barely process the words, still reeling from what had just happened, but the officer's explanation hit home. This had been planned, cold, calculated, and I had narrowly escaped becoming just another statistic in a pattern of terrifying break-ins. As I watched the officers handle the man, my gaze shifted to Max, who stood by my side, still tense but visibly more relaxed. His loyal, protective nature had kept me alive tonight. I knelt down to him, my hand shaking as I ruffled his fur. "You were amazing, buddy," I whispered, and he leaned into my touch as if acknowledging my gratitude. The officers soon escorted the man to the car, and as they drove off into the night, I closed the door behind me, locking it securely. But I couldn't shake the thought of the basement, of the strange feeling that had overtaken me when I descended those stairs. Whatever had happened that night, I knew I would never look at that basement or that door the same way again. I never imagined I'd end up telling a story like this. It sounds like something that could only happen in horror movies or true crime podcasts, but it happened to me. Let me introduce myself. My name's Jake. I live in a small house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It's not much, just a one-story place in California, but I like it. It's calm, peaceful, the kind of neighborhood where you can leave your doors unlocked and not worry about anything happening. Or at least that's what I thought. This particular night, I was alone, just like I was most nights. I had recently started working from home, so my days blurred together in front of the computer screen, and nights were spent in the comfort of my living room. I remember it being a typical Friday. The sky outside had just started to darken as the sun began its slow descent below the horizon. There was a soft orange hue that spread across the sky. Everything seemed normal. It had been a quiet day. I hadn't heard from anyone, and I hadn't had to leave the house for anything. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, trying to figure out what to do with the rest of the evening. I wasn't even paying much attention to the time. It was just past 8 p.m., I think, when it happened. A knock. At first, I thought maybe I hadn't heard it properly. I turned the volume down on my phone, listening intently, and then it came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. My heart gave a small jolt. It wasn't a casual knock. It wasn't a polite tap you'd get from a neighbor asking to borrow a cup of sugar. No, this was forceful, urgent, like the person on the other side of the door had something important to say. Something that couldn't wait. I sat still for a moment, unsure of what to do. Maybe it was just someone trying to sell me something or a neighbor with a question. Still, a strange feeling began to bubble up inside of me. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew it instinctively. I looked at the clock. 8:10. It wasn't late enough for people to be out and about socializing, but it wasn't early enough for a random visit either. I stood up slowly, my mind running through different scenarios as I walked to the door. The house was eerily quiet now, like the whole world had paused around me. I stood in front of the door, looking through the peephole. What I saw made my stomach drop. A man, in a police uniform. He was standing on my porch, his hands resting on the side of his waist. He had a badge on his chest, and the dark blue of his uniform seemed to blend with the night, almost like he was part of the shadows. The guy looked serious. His face was hard to read from that angle, but there was something off about the way he stood, too rigid, too tense, as though he was waiting for something to happen. But the most unsettling thing was his eyes. They were wide open, wide enough that it almost looked unnatural, like he was forcing himself to stay alert. I couldn't see his pupils clearly, but something about the way they flickered unnerved me. They darted from side to side, never focusing on anything for too long. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Police! Open up!" His voice was sharp, commanding. It had the authority of someone who wasn't about to be ignored. "I need to speak with you about a situation in the area. Open the door." For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me thought, it's a cop, it's fine. But something inside me told me this wasn't right. Why would a cop show up at my door unannounced? And why was he so urgent? I pulled back from the door, my heart thudding in my chest. My first instinct was to call the non-emergency police line and ask if they were sending anyone to my house. But then I remembered something I hadn't considered before. The guy hadn't identified himself over the intercom. He just kept banging on the door and demanding to be let in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I couldn't ignore the warning signals. Still, I didn't want to make a scene. Maybe he was an officer. Maybe he was really just responding to something nearby. I hadn't heard any sirens, but there were times when they didn't show up in full force. But my gut, it was screaming. I stepped away from the door and glanced around the house, thinking of what to do. The idea of opening the door felt terrifying, but I didn't know what else to do. I kept thinking, what if he's just doing his job? After what felt like an eternity of indecision, I decided to peek through the peephole again. His face was still there, but now I saw him looking around as if checking the surroundings. He wasn't making eye contact anymore. He was scanning the street, the trees, the neighbors' houses. I should have listened to my instincts, but I didn't. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain lock on. "Yes?" I called out, my voice betraying the nervousness I was trying to hide. "Police," the man said again, his voice a little softer this time, almost too calm. "I need to talk to you about a situation in the neighborhood. It's important." I stared at him, trying to make sense of the situation. He seemed like a cop, but something was off. He wasn't showing any kind of ID, no badge number, nothing. "Can I see some identification?" I asked, my voice sounding weaker than I wanted it to. For a brief moment, the man didn't say anything. He simply stared at me with those wide, unblinking eyes, his lips curling slightly into something that resembled a smile. Then he knocked again. Bang! 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 "Open the door now," he demanded, his voice low and filled with something cold. I said it's important. I don't know what possessed me, but I unlocked the door. The moment I did, everything happened so fast I barely had time to react. The door flew open with an aggressive force, knocking me back as the man shoved his way inside. I stumbled backward, heart racing, my hand still gripping the doorknob. "Hey!" I shouted, instinctively pushing against his chest, trying to stop him from fully entering. But it was like pushing against a wall. The man didn't even flinch. His hand shot out and grabbed me by the wrist, twisting it painfully as he pulled me toward him. My pulse was pounding in my ears now. My mind was racing. I was panicking. Who is this guy? What the hell is happening? "Let go of me," I screamed. But it didn't matter. The man didn't care. He was in the house now, and I was no longer in control. I took a deep breath, trying to focus, trying to think clearly. I had to do something. I couldn't just let him take me. I turned and grabbed the nearest thing I could reach, a small metal statue from the shelf. It felt heavy in my hand, but it was the only weapon I had. I swung it at him as hard as I could, but he dodged the blow with ease, almost like he knew it was coming. I stumbled off balance as my swing missed, and that's when he shoved me back harder than before. I crashed into the coffee table, knocking it over. The corner of the table scraped painfully along my side, but I barely registered the pain. All I could focus on was him. He was closing in, and I was running out of time. In a panic, I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around the room. I had to escape. The back door. I could make it to the backyard. I rushed for it, ignoring the dizziness in my head from the impact with the table. But just as my hand touched the door handle, I felt a sharp pain tear through my arm. The man had cut me. I didn't see him do it, but I felt the sting, cold steel sliding across my skin. My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't stop. I pulled the door open, flinging myself out into the backyard. The man didn't follow. I don't know why, but he didn't. I ran through the backyard and straight into my neighbor's yard, not caring who saw me, not even looking back. I just kept running, my breath ragged in my chest, until I finally reached their front door. I knocked furiously, almost crying from the fear and adrenaline. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. They answered after what seemed like forever, and I collapsed on their doorstep, gasping for air. The police arrived not long after, and we told them everything. The man had left by then. There was no trace of him. Nothing. They told me that they had been tracking a fugitive who had been posing as a police officer, breaking into homes across the area, and I was just lucky I managed to escape. Lucky. But lucky or not, I still couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I look at my door now, I remember what happened that night. Some people may have seen it coming. Some may have called it paranoia. But I know better now. There's a lot more lurking in the shadows than I ever thought possible. I've always considered myself a pretty grounded guy. Practical, no nonsense. I'm in my mid-30s, grew up in a small suburban neighborhood in California, just outside of Los Angeles, and things around here were always pretty calm. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other and it felt pretty safe. The kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked during the day and there'd never be a second thought about it. People left their cars running in the driveway while they ran inside to grab a forgotten item, and no one would bat an eye. But over the years, I became more cautious, more aware of the reality that safety is never guaranteed, no matter how secure a neighborhood might seem. Maybe it's because of the things I'd heard growing up, stories of things that happen in the dark corners of the world, in places you wouldn't expect. Now, I'm in my late 20s, living alone in a small one-bedroom house I rent. It's cozy and quiet, with a small backyard that gets a lot of sunshine during the day. For the most part, my days were filled with work, and my nights were spent in the usual routine: dinner, a little bit of TV, and then bed. Nothing extraordinary. I didn't mind it. I liked the solitude. The house, though small, was mine, and I took care of it. The walls were painted a soft cream, and the hardwood floors creaked when you walked on them in just the right way. There was a small living room with a couch I'd inherited from my parents, and a TV that was probably too big for the space but felt right when I sank into it after a long day. That night, however, was different. It's funny how it always starts out like any other night, right? You don't expect anything strange, and that's what makes it all the more terrifying when it happens. It was a typical evening, or at least I thought it was. I had just gotten off work around 9 p.m. and made a quick dinner, a bowl of spaghetti, nothing fancy, just some pasta, marinara sauce, and a side of garlic bread. My house was quiet, just how I liked it. I had no roommates or pets, so the house was just mine to enjoy. The windows were shut tight and the blinds were drawn. The last thing I needed was for anyone to look in and see the mess I might have left on the counter or the laundry scattered around the place. I'd learned over the years to keep the house locked, even if it seemed overkill. Growing up, I'd always been warned to be cautious, especially living in a city, no matter how safe it seemed. The night wasn't particularly cold, but there was this soft, dry wind rustling the palm trees outside. I noticed the wind tapping against the window every now and then, but nothing that felt out of place. I finished my meal, cleaned up, and started to watch a movie, just something to pass the time before going to bed. The movie wasn't anything special, just some comedy to help me unwind. It was funny, but I wasn't really paying attention to it. My mind wandered to work, to random thoughts about what I needed to do tomorrow, and just the general flow of life. It was around midnight when I decided to turn in. I did my usual routine, brushed my teeth, got changed, and checked all the doors and windows one last time before heading to bed. I made sure my front door was locked, the back door too, and even the windows, though none of them were open. I'm paranoid about security, so I even locked the door to my bedroom, but I was careful to always keep the key on the nightstand, just in case. Just for peace of mind. I liked knowing that I had a way out if I ever needed it, even if that was just a comforting thought. But then something weird happened. I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't even remember hearing anything at first, but something was different. My eyes flicked open, and for some reason I immediately felt that something was wrong. I didn't know what it was, but there was this palpable tension in the room, like someone was watching me. My bedroom was pitch black except for a sliver of moonlight coming through the window. Everything seemed normal, but there was this heavy feeling in the air, like a quiet weight pressing down on me. I didn't know why, but I turned my head toward the door. That's when I saw it. The door to my bedroom, the one I always lock, was wide open. I froze. My heart literally stopped for a second. I swear, I had locked that door. I knew I had. But now it was open. I couldn't even hear anything, but the air felt too still. It was almost like the whole house had gone mute. My heart was pounding in my chest, and a sudden cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the tightness in my chest. I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. I thought maybe I had just forgotten to lock it, but my gut told me something else. It wasn't like I had left it cracked open either. This was wide open, the door practically ajar. I could see the dim hallway light shining through, casting long shadows on the walls. My mind raced with all sorts of thoughts, most of them not good. I was alone in the house. I hadn't heard anyone come in. My phone was on the nightstand, just within arm's reach. I was debating whether or not to check it, maybe call someone, but I was paralyzed. My instincts screamed at me to get up, to go see what was going on, but I couldn't. I stayed frozen under the covers, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The silence was deafening. I don't know how much time passed, maybe minutes, maybe longer, but I eventually forced myself to sit up slowly. My back was tight with fear, and I felt my pulse echo in my ears. The door was still open, the dark hallway beyond still eerily quiet. I didn't hear any footsteps, no creaks, no movements. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels like it's pressing in on you. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. It wasn't like it just appeared out of nowhere, but more like it slowly stepped into the room from the shadows. My eyes darted to it, and my breath caught in my throat. There was a person standing at the foot of my bed, barely visible in the dim moonlight, but I could make out the silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could tell it wasn't someone I knew. Their body was tense, and the figure didn't move. I could feel the fear wrapping around me like a vice. My body was telling me to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Then, in a low, cold voice, the person spoke. "Don't make a sound." My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't even dare to breathe. Then I saw it, the glint of a knife in the person's hand, reflecting the dim light. My eyes widened, and my stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't someone trying to mess with me. I was face to face with an intruder, and they were armed. I didn't know what to do. Should I try to jump up and fight back? Should I try to escape? There was a knot in my stomach so tight it almost hurt. I thought about my phone. I thought about the door, the window. I could try to run, but I didn't know how much time I had. One wrong move, and I'd be in danger. The figure took a step closer, his silhouette dark against the wall, and I could see his breath now. It was shallow, steady, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. The calmness, the control he had over the situation, it didn't feel like a robbery. It felt like he was waiting for something. For a split second, I thought about yelling out to see if anyone would hear, but then I heard it, a loud knock on the front door. I couldn't believe it. It was so sudden and unexpected. I almost thought I had imagined it at first. The intruder's head whipped toward the door, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. But before he could react, I heard another knock, this time even louder. "Police! Open up!" The intruder stiffened, and I saw his grip tighten on the knife. But before he could make another move, the front door swung open, just as loud as the knocks, and I saw two officers standing in the doorway, flashlights trained on him. "Stay down!" one of them shouted as they rushed in. The intruder didn't resist. He dropped the knife immediately, his hands raised in the air. I don't even remember how I managed to stand up. One of the officers quickly ushered me out of the room, while the other cuffed the man and escorted him outside. I don't remember much after that. I think I was in shock, but I could hear the officers talking about how a neighbor had seen the intruder enter through a window and immediately called 911. I don't know how the neighbor saw him. Maybe they were up late, or maybe they had just happened to be walking by. But I'll be forever grateful for that. When I finally sat down on the couch, I couldn't stop shaking. My mind kept replaying the image of the figure standing in the shadows, the knife in his hand. It felt like a nightmare, but it wasn't. It was real. And it could have been so much worse if that knock hadn't come when it did. The police told me the guy had been watching my house for weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't know him. I didn't know why he picked me, but I was just glad it was over. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept checking the locks over and over again, but no matter how many times I checked, I knew something had changed. My world was different now. I had to learn how to live with the reality that I wasn't as safe as I once thought. And every time I closed my eyes, I could still see that figure standing at the foot of my bed. It all started so innocently, like any other Friday night in Sacramento, California. I had just finished a long week of work. My roommates had decided to take a weekend trip out of town to visit their families, and I was left with the house all to myself. Normally, I love this solitude. There's something peaceful about the emptiness of the house, no noise, no one around. It's comforting, like being wrapped in a soft blanket of silence. No expectations, no disturbances, just me and my thoughts. The evening had started off normal. I made myself dinner, a simple pasta dish, and watched some TV. Around 10:30 p.m., I felt the heaviness of the day settle in. The exhaustion from the week started to catch up to me. I'd always enjoyed having some time to unwind before bed, so I decided to get into bed a bit earlier than usual. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through Instagram, aimlessly flipping through posts, not really paying attention to anything in particular. It was peaceful, quiet. Everything was perfectly calm. I lay there in bed, the room only dimly lit by the faint glow of my phone screen. The walls of my room were painted a soft, calming beige, and the floorboards creaked slightly beneath me as I shifted. I could hear the distant sounds of cars driving by outside, the occasional bark of a dog, but nothing out of the ordinary. The house had always felt safe, like nothing could ever break that peace. It was just me, in my own little bubble, scrolling through social media, mindlessly killing time before I would fall asleep. But then, that moment came. I was halfway through a post when I heard it. A sound. At first, it was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it. Just a soft noise that could have been the house settling, the wind outside maybe, or a branch brushing against the side of the house. I brushed it off, but then I heard it again. This time a little louder, a slow, steady breath. It wasn't a gust of wind, it wasn't the house creaking. I froze. It was coming from outside my window. I could feel the blood drain from my face as my body went still, like a deer sensing danger in the woods. My phone was still in my hand, but I couldn't focus on it anymore. All I could hear was that breath. It was deliberate, slow, like someone was standing right outside taking deep, measured breaths. I don't know what made me do it, but I slowly set my phone down on the bed. My heart started to pound in my chest. The breath continued, steady but unmistakable. I slid out of bed slowly, trying to make no noise. My feet touched the cool wooden floor, sending a chill up my spine. The silence of the room felt oppressive, suffocating. The air felt heavy. I could almost taste the tension. I crept toward the window, moving as quietly as I could, praying that whoever it was outside hadn't noticed any movement from inside. My heart was racing. My throat was tight. I reached the window and stopped. I was standing right next to it now. I felt the coldness of the glass against my fingertips as I carefully pulled the curtain back just enough to see outside. Nothing. I squinted, trying to make out anything in the darkness. The backyard was dark, the dim light of the street lamp barely cutting through the thick trees. The yard was surrounded by a tall wooden fence, which made it almost impossible to see anything past the first few feet. I couldn't see anyone, but then again, I wasn't sure what I expected to see. And then, As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I noticed something. Movement. A figure. A man. At first, it didn't even register. He was crouched low to the ground, almost hidden in the shadows near the far corner of the yard next to the fence. He wasn't standing. He was just there. And then I saw him shift. His body barely moved, but the way he positioned himself told me he was waiting, watching. I don't know how long he had been there. I had been scrolling on my phone, completely unaware of anyone lurking in my backyard. My stomach twisted into knots as I stood there, paralyzed. I didn't know what to do, how to react. The man didn't move. He was still, watching. I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. My mind raced. I should call someone. I should scream, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. My body was frozen, my breath caught in my chest. I couldn't look away. Suddenly, there was another noise, a rustling sound, like branches moving. My heart skipped a beat. The man was standing now, barely visible, but I could see the vague outline of his body. He was tall, his form silhouetted against the dark sky. He didn't move closer to the house, but he didn't seem to move away either. It was like he was waiting for something. I stepped back from the window, my legs weak and shaky. I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck as I backed away from the window. My mind was in a panic, but my body was still. I didn't know what he wanted or why he was there, but every fiber of my being was telling me to get away from the window, to leave the room, to lock the door and hide. I turned toward the door to my room. I wanted to lock it, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the window for too long. I didn't trust that I'd be safe for even a second if I let my guard down. Then, without warning, the man moved again. This time it was too fast. I heard him take a step, then another, before I saw him dart into the shadows, disappearing from my view. I didn't wait. I immediately grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling as I pressed the numbers. I spoke as clearly as I could, trying to explain that someone was outside my house, possibly trying to break in. I could barely get the words out. My voice was shaky. I kept hearing the rustling of the bushes outside, and my eyes kept darting to the window, expecting to see him again at any moment. The dispatcher told me to stay calm, to lock all doors, and to wait for the police. But I couldn't wait. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I knew something was wrong. I knew he was still out there. I had to do something. I moved to the bathroom, locking the door behind me, my heart racing faster with every passing second. I crouched in the corner, still clutching my phone in one hand, my other hand pressed tightly against my mouth to keep from screaming. It felt like an eternity before I heard it. A sharp, distinct sound. Glass shattering. I felt my body stiffen, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The sound of glass breaking pierced through the silence, and I knew immediately that he had gotten inside. The man was in my house. I didn't know where he was or what he was doing, but I could hear his footsteps now, slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the terror. Every movement he made sent a chill down my spine. I could feel him in the house. He was close. Too close. I stayed as still as I could, my eyes wide and my body frozen, waiting for the police. I could hear him moving through the hallway now, shuffling around, the unmistakable sound of drawers opening, items being knocked over. He was searching for something. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I could barely hear the police sirens over the sound of my own heartbeat. But then I heard a loud bang, then another and another. The police were here. I didn't know what happened next. I could only listen from my corner of the bathroom, waiting for the moment when everything would come crashing down. And then I heard a voice. A shout. Stop! Don't move! The footsteps that had been slow and methodical moments earlier now turned into a frantic scramble. I heard the man running through the house, his shoes pounding against the wooden floors. I heard the sound of him hitting something, crashing into a table or chair, as if he was trying to make a quick escape. The police shouted commands, the sound of them moving through the house, and then, finally, there was silence. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. I waited, still pressed against the wall, not knowing if the danger was truly over. Finally, I heard voices, official, calm. The police had caught him. He had been trying to flee through the back door, but the officers had already surrounded the house. They had caught him right as he was trying to escape into the yard. The man was arrested. His face was unfamiliar, his expression one of defeat and anger. He was later identified as someone with a long history of breaking into homes. It seemed I wasn't the first person he'd targeted, but for some reason, I was the one he'd chosen that night. The police found evidence of him stealing from the house. My jewelry box, along with a few other valuables. But what unsettled me the most was how methodical he had been, how he'd planned it, how he'd waited, how close he had come to getting away. The entire thing felt like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. But at least, in the end, he was caught. The officers told me that he had been in and out of prison for similar crimes, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. How many more times had he done this? How many times had he watched, waiting for his moment to strike? And why did he come to my house? That night, I learned that even in the most peaceful places, danger can lurk in the most unexpected ways. You never really know who's watching. I'll never forget the night my life almost changed forever. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, just me and my house. I didn't expect anything unusual. Nothing was out of the ordinary, no strange sounds, no weird events, but that all changed in the span of a few minutes. It's been 2 years now, but I still can't shake the feeling of what happened. I lie awake sometimes, wondering if it was all just a nightmare or if it really happened. The scariest part is that it was real, and it happened to me. It was a quiet Wednesday evening in late October. The kind of night when the air starts to get that crisp, cool bite. A night where you can feel the change in the season, where autumn begins to claim its hold. I'd had a long, exhausting day at work. My job isn't terrible, but it can be draining. After a day spent dealing with clients, emails, and tasks piling up left and right, I was looking forward to just getting home, kicking back, and relaxing. The house I lived in at the time was a small, single-story home nestled on the outskirts of a quiet suburb in California. It wasn't particularly large, but it had character. It was cozy, the kind of place that feels like it belongs to you from the moment you step inside. The walls were painted in warm, earthy tones, and the soft wooden floors creaked underfoot in a way that felt familiar, as though the house itself was alive. It had that perfect balance of comfort and seclusion, close enough to the hustle and bustle of the city, but far enough away that I could still enjoy a bit of peace. The houses around mine were spaced just far enough apart that you didn't feel crowded. It was the perfect place to unwind, to have space to yourself. I'd lived there for a couple of years, and it was exactly what I needed. When I arrived home, the sun had already set, and the streets were eerily quiet. There was a slight chill in the air, a sign that winter was not far behind. The kind of quiet that only happens late at night when most people are indoors, winding down after their own busy days. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and there was something almost serene about the way the wind rustled the leaves. I walked inside, greeted by the familiar, comforting scent of my home. Wood, a hint of lavender from the candles I kept lit, and the faint smell of my homemade dinner that lingered from earlier. I dropped my keys into the bowl by the door and kicked off my shoes. The creak of the wooden floors beneath my feet echoed through the house as I walked into the living room. I threw my bag on the couch and changed into more comfortable clothes, relieved to be out of my work clothes. I grabbed a quick snack from the kitchen. Nothing elaborate, just some crackers and cheese, and settled into my spot on the couch. It was the kind of night where I didn't want to do anything too intense. I just wanted to scroll mindlessly through my phone and enjoy the peaceful silence that surrounded me. The living room was dimly lit, with a soft golden glow from the lamp in the corner, casting gentle shadows across the room. The rest of the house was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees outside, a comforting sound I'd come to associate with solitude. The hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of cars passing by on the street were the only things that broke the stillness. It was calm, nothing out of the ordinary. I felt safe, at ease. Around 10:30 p.m., I decided it was time to call it a night. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. The air felt cool, and the soft, rhythmic sounds of the night seemed to lull me into a sense of security. There was something almost magical about it, like everything was in perfect harmony. I went to bed, the quiet of the night enveloping me as I snuggled under the covers. But then, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was the creak of the house settling, or a branch brushing against the side of the house. The house had a way of making noise sometimes, especially when the wind picked up. But then the footsteps continued. They weren't random noises. These were deliberate, methodical steps, as though someone was walking through the house. The sound was faint at first, but unmistakable. I lay there, frozen for a moment. My heart began to race, and an uncomfortable sensation started to creep over me. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, or maybe even a stray noise from the house settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps weren't in my imagination. I slowly turned my head toward the doorway of my bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, as it always was when I went to bed. Through the crack, I could just make out the dark hallway beyond. I strained my ears, trying to listen for any other sounds, but there was nothing, just the steady, rhythmic footsteps moving closer. I felt a knot form in my stomach. It's hard to explain, but I just knew something was wrong. I wasn't alone in my house. I was certain of it. Slowly, I sat up in bed. My muscles were tight, and every nerve was on high alert. The footsteps had stopped, but I was still on edge, waiting for the next sound. Was it a burglar? Someone who had broken into the house? My mind raced, my thoughts like a chaotic storm of fear. I could hear my pulse in my ears, each thud louder than the last. I told myself I needed to investigate, but at the same time, every part of me was screaming to stay put. My body froze, but my mind was spinning. What if I was wrong? What if it was just a stray noise or something innocent? But the longer I lay there, the more I was convinced that something was wrong. I had to act, but every instinct told me that moving might make things worse. The footsteps started again. This time, they were closer. I could hear them clearly now, the soft but deliberate sound of someone walking through the hallway, coming closer and closer to my bedroom. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. My voice shook as I whispered into the phone, "Someone is in my house. Please send help now." My words were rushed, desperate, barely more than a squeak, but the operator's calm voice came through the line. "Stay quiet. Help is on the way. Stay hidden." The words barely registered in my mind. The tension in my chest was suffocating, each second feeling like an eternity. I couldn't let whoever was out there know I was on to them. I moved with excruciating slowness, trying to be as quiet as possible, praying that the intruder didn't hear me. My heart was pounding in my chest, so loud that I wondered if he could hear it too. I crept toward the window, but as I neared the door, the floorboard creaked under my foot, sharp and unforgiving. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Silence. I held my breath, every muscle in my body coiled with fear. Time seemed to stretch on forever. I stared at the crack in the door, waiting, praying that I wasn't seen. And then, just as I thought I might be able to relax for a second, I saw it. A shadow. A figure, tall and indistinct, standing just outside the hallway. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was too tall, too still, the outline of a man, but something about it felt wrong. He was motionless, just standing there, watching. My instincts screamed at me to stay silent, to stay hidden. If I made a sound, if I moved, he would know I was aware of him. I had to stay invisible. Then, without warning, he stepped forward. The soft thud of his footsteps echoed down the hallway, deliberate and slow. Each step was heavy with purpose, as though he no longer cared to conceal his presence. He wasn't just passing by, he was coming toward my bedroom. Panic surged through me. I knew I had to act, and quickly. I turned, whispering into the phone, 911, please, help. He's coming toward my bedroom. My voice was barely a whisper, but every word was thick with fear. Before I could finish my sentence, a cold hand seized my arm from behind. I gasped, and before I could react, he slammed me to the ground with brutal force, knocking the breath from my lungs. My head cracked against the tile, and for a moment, everything went fuzzy. The world spun around me, but I could still feel his hands on my throat, squeezing like a vice, tightening with unrelenting force. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. My body fought against him, thrashing desperately, but his grip was unyielding. In that moment, all I could think was that I had to escape. I had to survive. With a burst of energy, I kicked as hard as I could, my foot connecting with his side. He stumbled back, just enough for me to break free. I remembered the lamp, the metal lamp on the nightstand. It was the only weapon I had, and in that moment, I knew I had to use it. I grabbed it with all the strength I could muster, swinging it upwards with everything I had. The lamp collided with his face with a sickening crack, and he stumbled back, disoriented. He collapsed to the floor. That was enough time for me to scramble to my feet, gasping for air. My neck was sore, my vision blurry, but I didn't care. It felt like an eternity before the police arrived, though in reality it was only a few minutes. They searched the house and discovered that the man had entered through a kitchen window, one I hadn't even realized was left unlocked. They arrested him, pulling him away in handcuffs, his presence now nothing more than a chilling memory. To this day, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind, every open window sends a chill down my spine. I check every lock, every door, every window, again and again, unable to shake the feeling that I'm never truly safe here anymore. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the Vault awaits your return.